Whether you believe in hell or not, here are a few scary stories about hell, demons, and the devil himself. So, I used to house sit for this lady. Check out my Ouija board stories to hear more scary stories about this particular house that I would house sit. So, this was after I had gotten rid of the Ouija board, and this was one of the last times that I was house sitting for her. So, I was sleeping, and basically, I had a dream that I died somehow, and I was sent down to the underworld. This in my dream, I was forced to speak with the devil himself, but in my dream, he was referred to as Hades. And so I'm standing in front of this, I'm standing in a big, empty area, and in front of me is this big concrete wall, and it's dark, and on the wall, I just see a shadow of him casted onto the wall, and I'm talking to his shadow. And in his shadow, all I can see is like his head. I see his jaw, like a strong jaw, and like two horns. And he had a very deep demonic voice. And basically, he told me that I was gonna go to heaven, but first, before I could, I had a job to do for him first. Like, I had to serve a sentence for him before I could be sent up to heaven. And my job was to haunt sinners up on earth to the point where they, either murdered someone or to the point where they unalived themselves. I went to earth and I haunted countless sinners and drove countless people absolutely crazy. It was all going by really fast, especially as I got more and more used to being a ghost-like figure and doing specific things that would push people over a violent edge. But then I started haunting this guy. He was a bodybuilder and he was on steroids. He was super big and super tall, and he had a really bad anger problem. I wasn't afraid to haunt him because I knew that there was no possible way that he could see me or do anything to hurt me. So I had this kind of like nonchalant attitude. But he would turn out to be the most challenging person to haunt and torment up to this point. So I remember being in his kitchen, and I remember his face being completely red with his veins popping out. He was in a rage. And I was just like standing by his counter, like leaning on his kitchen island, and I was just pushing things off the island onto the floor. And he started screaming, and he looked right at me as he was screaming. And this really startled me because it really seemed like he could genuinely see where I was standing. I knocked another thing off of his counter, and he came running toward me. He came right up to me and started screaming right in my face. He was a lot taller than me, but he even looked down at me, and I knew at this point that he really could sense exactly where I was and even sense my height. I didn't move though. I looked right up at him and I started screaming back into his face. I remember clearly seeing the fear wash over his face at all this time haunting him, and this was the first time I saw his fear. He looked absolutely terrified as his face began to twist and distort, and I knew that he could definitely hear and feel me screaming back at him. He took a moment to regain his composure, and he started screaming at me again. This is when I opened my mouth to scream back at him, but when I did, I felt the devil himself standing right behind me with his mouth pressed up against the back of my head. And the devil was now using my mouth to scream through me. And it was the most demonic and deepest voice scream that came bellowing out of my mouth. And it was the devil or Hades screaming from behind my head. I was in shock as I was now being used as a human puppet, and I had no control over my mouth or my body. I watched again the bodybuilder's face in front of me begin to twist and distort with fear. And it even looked like his flesh was starting to melt, right off of his skull as he was being screamed at. And the devil moved away from me and took his deep, demonic scream with him. And the screaming changed to where it was just me screaming. And this is when I screamed myself awake. I screamed myself awake and immediately sat up in my bed, startled by my own screaming. And then the confusion of waking up in someone else's house made me even more terrified. It was around 3:30 a.m., so it was dark out, and I was way too scared to go back to sleep. I grabbed the dog that I was babysitting and cuddled her the rest of that night and just could not sleep. Later that morning, I sent a group text message to my dad and my brothers, telling them all about the Hades dream that I just had. And my dad texted back and jokingly said, "That's what you get for having had played with a Ouija board." And my brothers kind of just laughed it off. But to this day, I still remember that dream so clearly. It's probably the scariest dream that I've ever had in my life. So now I do want to tell another hell story. This is about a man named Dominic Morrow and his terrifying journey through the depths of hell. This wasn't a dream he had, it was an actual experience he had after he was shot and killed. So you could argue and say that it was a dream. We'll never really know what exactly it was, but Dominic truly believes that he went to hell and that hell is a real place. So this is his story. So to this day, Dominic has PTSD of this experience he had. Smells of fire and barbecues and fire pits really trigger him. And to this day, he has trouble sleeping, and sometimes he experiences paranoia and anxiety attacks where he thinks he's still in hell. So, to give you some background, Dominic grew up in Chicago. His father passed away when he was really young, and his mom was left to raise him, his little brother, and his sister by herself. But when he was still a kid, his mom became addicted to crack cocaine. He ended up then he ended up joining a gang when he was only 12 years old. The gang was not easy on him for being 12 years old. It was actually the opposite. They would send him out on a lot of missions because they knew that if he got caught, he would only be charged as a juvenile. So they really abused him and forced him to do a lot of things compared to other gang members. And this was a kind of gang that you could never leave it. Like he did not have a way out of this gang. The only way out, he says, was to die. And as he got older, he ended up making quite a bit of money by stealing and selling drugs through this gang. And in June of 2009, he set out with some members to go shopping and clubbing. And he thought he was in a safe area where he wasn't going to run into anyone that would give him issues like a rival or anything like that. But as he left a store in this area, he saw a guy outside the store sitting on his car. And this guy gave him a really bad feeling. But he brushed it off and he left and went into another store, came out of that store later on and saw the same guy had moved his car and was again sitting on top of his car in front of the store. After this happened a third time, Dominic told his friend who he was shopping with, that he suspected that this guy that was sitting on the car every time they came out of a store was following them. But his friend didn't believe him and just kind of helped him brush it off. And a few hours later, they were back at their building and they were getting ready to go clubbing. And they came out of their building, and the same guy that was sitting on the car was now standing in front of their building gate. And so Dominic walked up to the guy with the intention of asking him if he knew him. But before Dominic could say anything, the guy asked him if he had a light. So this is when Dominic reached down into his pocket to grab his lighter. And as he was reaching down, he just sees this bright green flash. And all he could see was this flash. And as the flash kind of dissipated, he saw evil in this man's face. And the man was holding a gun. Come to find out later on that this man was in the same gang as Dominic. The man then shot him a second time, and Dominic said he felt a force. It felt like getting hit by a sledgehammer. It was that forceful, and he flew back. And as he was falling back, everything felt like it was in slow motion. And he flew backwards and landed on his back. But as he was laying on his back, he then starts feeling like he's falling forward. And he knows that he's on his back, but he's feeling like he's falling forward now. And he said that it felt like he was falling at the speed of light. And he was surrounded by this very intense darkness. He described it as a spiritual darkness. As he was falling forward, he still had all of his senses, and all of his senses were actually heightened. He could see better, he could hear better, he could smell better. And as he was falling, he felt terrorized. He describes this terror as a terror without limit. and he started to feel positive attributes leaving him, such as love, hope, joy, etc. It was like they were all just leaving him as he was falling forward, and all he could feel more and more of was despair, fear, loneliness, regret, and hopelessness. And he also noticed that as he was falling, he could smell a very distinct smell. He states that if a person were to get one whiff of this smell, they would die. It was so bad and so extreme. It's unimaginable. And he also said that as he was falling, he felt heat coming upon him, and he could see a light growing. And it it was as if he was falling into another dimension. And as the light beneath him got bigger and bigger, he started hearing screaming. Millions and millions of people screaming. And he had an inner knowing that he could individualize each scream simultaneously. It's not like when you're at a concert or a sports event and everyone's screaming and it kind of sounds like you're hearing just one big scream meshed together. He said like completely different than that, where you could individualize each scream and know like the pain behind each scream. And what he thought was the light coming toward him, it looked like a well, like a water well, and it was made of stones, and inside was illuminated. The stones were illuminated by a fire burning from within, and it was essentially a portal to hell. And he instinctively knew that he was inside the earth at this point. He knew that he was in the earth. And this portal sucked him in with an intense force. It sucked him in really aggressively and then threw him really hard onto the ground. And he was still surrounded by darkness. And when he landed, he then saw a pit about 100 to 200 feet in front of him, and illuminated with a flame. At that point, he could see everything, and he saw rows and rows and rows of giant pits that were filled with fire and people burning alive in the fire and lava in all of these pits. And he saw that these people were all naked, and a portion of them were full-bodied, but others were just pure bone, like skeletons. And then another portion of people amongst the others had flesh dripping off of them like zombies, just melting off. And it was like they would be full bodied, their flesh would melt off to the point where they're bone, and then their skin and stuff would grow back. So it was just a continuous loop of flesh being burned off over and over again as these people were like burning in an endless fire. And all these people in the pits were trying to crawl out, and they were crawling on top of each other, like he described it as like crabs in a trap, like crawling over each other, trying to get out, just clawing at each other as their flesh was melting off of their bodies. And this is when he saw the demons, which he describes as giant reptile creatures with yellow eyes, like 10 to 15 feet tall, giant reptile creatures. And these demons were surrounding the pits and laughing at the people in these pits. And as the people would climb up the edge of these pits, the demons would pick them up and throw them back into the pit. And Dominic states that he could feel the hatred coming off of these demons, and that their hate alone could penetrate and destroy a physical body. Like, their hatred is unfathomable. It was overwhelming, and he could feel it. It was so much hatred. He states that when the demons would laugh at the people that were suffering, it would cause his whole body to hurt and ache and pain. And he explains that in the spiritual realm, pain is not isolated to one part of your body. When you feel pain, it affects your entire body. And in that sense, the pain is much, much more intense. So when they would laugh, it would just make his whole entire body feel so much pain. And he knew that these demons were feeding off of the pain from the people in these pits and from himself. And the demons were also feeding off of other negative emotions like anger, regret, and fear. And Dominic also claims that it felt like he was wearing a wetsuit that weighed 1,000 pounds. It was practically impossible for him to move. And it was so hard for him to breathe, like he could not get any oxygen. And it was just like a sensory overload as well. It was just very overwhelming, everything that was going on. And he could feel also the regret off of the other people in hell, like in the pits. And it was unbearable to him. He could feel all of their regret. It was just overwhelming regret. Regret of the choices that these people had made, that ultimately led them to this eternity of suffering. And also the heat was so intense. It felt like he was being burned by fire over and over again on a loop. Like, he describes that first initial feeling you get when you're being burned, like that immediate sense of pain you feel. It was just a continuous burning feeling like that. Like, there was no getting used to the pain you would be feeling. There was no like nerve damage that would happen. There was no getting used to the heat that you're in. It was just a constant state of being burned. And he also felt like he hadn't had a drink in months. He was so incredibly thirsty. However, time did not exist in this place. He knew that he was in a timeless, eternal dimension. He had this inner knowing that this was just an eternal place where time did not exist. And he then compares it to what it was like to be in jail. However, when he was in jail, he had hope and he had a sense of time, where he knew that it was just a matter of time where he could feel relief. But in this place, there was no such thing as hope, and there was no such thing as any kind of relief in the future, even if that meant death. Like, there was no such thing. It was just an eternity of hopelessness. And he describes the demons to be incredibly grotesque. They smelled really, really bad, like the worst smell you could ever smell times 1,000. Like, it was just like it was just very, very grotesque, and their hatred was beyond comprehension. And it was like the demons were in a perpetual state of decay as well. Most of them were disfigured and deformed, and they were hideous, and only some of them were humanoid. Some of them looked more like animal creatures, and there were others that looked more like insect creatures. They were just a like a vast um, like type of demons that were there, all just very grotesque looking and scary. And a few of these demons even tortured Dominic while he was there. They opened his mouth so wide that it broke his jaw, and then they poured lava down his throat. And then one of them grabbed him with their giant claws and threw him. And he felt so much pain, like so much pain, like the most pain you could ever feel. And he was hurting so much, but he states that the thing that hurt him the most in this place was this feeling of that he deserved to be there, that he deserved to be receiving this punishment and this pain and this torture. That's what was hurting him the most, was this feeling of I deserve this, which is really weird to think about and fathom. So, and then as he was tossed, he hit a stone wall, and as soon as he looked up, he saw a mountain as far up as you could imagine. And on the sides of this mountain were just tons and tons of jail cells, as far as you could see upwards and back along this mountain were just cells and cells of people. And who knows how long that these people were there, but it seemed to him that they were there so long that they themselves were turning into demons. And he could hear the demons talking to each other, and whenever they would talk to each other, it would cause his whole body to physically hurt and ache. He also claims that this hell place was very organized. It was chaotic with torture and just an overwhelming sense of negative emotions that you could imagine, but it was all very, very organized. And he could feel, all he could feel was fear and regret. But as he was lying there, he was just overwhelmed with tons of negative emotions: anger, despair, hopelessness, loneliness, sadness, and physical pain. And the sounds of the people screaming all around him, and the demons laughing and talking, and the fire pits, it made it even harder for him to move. It was like being in this weird tunnel, and it was just like so hard for him to move and so hard for him to like process anything. It was so overwhelming for him. He states that in hell as well, everything was, very organized and compartmentalized. He believes to be coordinated with different sins. So basically, the main sin that a person was guilty of in their lifetime determined which compartment or department they would end up in within hell. And he could basically differentiate different departments of hell, and he would instinctively know what sin was associated by whatever torture was happening. He states that hell was more organized than any army is here on earth, and the demons all had a job, And if they were to slack off, then they themselves would get tortured. Everything was running off of fear, torture, and hatred. And Dominic then goes on to say that he was tossed a second time, and this time he passes through a few different sections, and he gets to a section where he sees demons ripping limbs off of people, and their limbs would immediately grow back. And it was just a continuous loop of violent torture like that. And he also witnessed demons making human shish kebabs by stacking people onto spears and walking around with people on these sticks as they were bleeding out and crying in pain, stacked up onto each other. And it was just a continuous loop of physical, unimaginable, violent torture. And he heard people begging. He heard all different kinds of people begging for any kind of relief. Even if it was just a temporary moment of relief where they were not being tortured, they were begging just for one small moment of not being tortured. But these people were forced to just continue in this never-ending loop of feeling intense regret while enduring unbelievable physical pain, like unimaginable pain. He was then thrown to another part of hell, where he found himself standing on a cliff. He looked down and he saw a path with a whole line of demons that were chained together. And when he looked up, he saw these wrought iron gates that were like 80 to 100 feet tall that surrounded this ancient looking castle within a giant mountain. And he instantly knew that beyond those gates, in this castle within the mountain, was what much worse than what he had witnessed up to that point. He knew was just the most like unimaginable torture going on behind those gates. It's just, you can't even put it into words like how torturous it would be. It was just the most suffering that you could imagine on for an eternity. And this is when Dominic experienced God with him. And he realized now that God was intentionally showing him that what hell was, before bringing him back up to our physical realm, where he would ultimately survive 2 gunshot wounds on top of that terrifying journey through the depths of hell. He states that he woke up in a hospital bed and saw a nurse, and the nurse was shocked to see him, and he, at this point, he was so terrified. He didn't know if he was back on earth or still in hell at this point. He was so traumatized that he didn't even want to close his eyes because he was so scared of going back to whatever that place was. And yeah, that's why to this day he has PTSD. And now he's spreading his message around, trying to get the word out, because he truly believes that what he experienced was real. So it's up to you to decipher whether you believe him or not. Whether you do or not, it's a terrifying experience. I can't imagine having PTSD over an experience like that, even if it was just a dream. To have PTSD, and it's like such a realistic dream like that, like the most horrifying dream imaginable, I would say, is just absolutely terrifying. So I highly recommend checking out his interview with Randy Kay. I've linked the video below in my description. I did leave out some very graphic parts and details of his story, so it is actually worse than what I have told. So if you're curious to hear more about what his experience was and to hear his own words, definitely check out his video. And if you want to hear more scary stories by me, go ahead and hit my subscribe button, and it would help me out a lot if you gave my like button a hug and a pat on the head. Thank you for listening, and that's all for now.